Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give it a minute or two so that people can get logged in. All right. Thank you again for joining us. We have lots of attendees today, so we just want to give it a minute. All right, I'm seeing a critical mass. So I'm going to go ahead and get the session started. So welcome again. Thank you for joining us. This is the third webinar in our Affordable Housing 101 Back to Basics series. So I'll post in the chat shortly details for our next two sessions because we have two more in this series. But today we're covering project feasibility analysis, how a developer assesses land use potential for future affordable housing. And our speaker today is Laura Regas. She is the Senior Vice President of Development at Abode Communities, and she's also a board member of SCAMP. She has taught some version of this session for SCAMP since 2018, so you're in good hands with her. As a matter of logistics, we will share the recording and slides later with all registrants, and we'll have time for questions today at the end of the session, so please post in the Q&A box, not in the chat. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura to get us started.
Thanks, Jeanette, and hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm honored that you would spend an hour of your day with me today. So thanks so much for being here. I know everybody has busy schedules. Just some kind of level setting for our chat today. This is really intended to be a high-level conversation about how your typical affordable housing developer approaches a new opportunity. So big picture, things to think about, questions to ask. We're not going to get into the real nitty gritty of, modeling and then attaching it to financing, but we're going to talk about big picture concepts and things you should be thinking about and looking for. And a little bit about this session is originally kind of crafted for sharing information with our public agency partners, but also information for kind of new coming folks to the development field. So we try to create information that's useful kind of for the larger field. So with that said, I should just say probably a few words about Abode Communities in case you're not familiar with us. Abode Communities is a large nonprofit affordable housing developer. We're based here in LA County, although we work all over the state and in other parts of the SCAMP region, but our history is here originally doing work in the city and county of LA. So we're you may see or hear some examples from me that are a little bit LA centric, but that does not mean that they're solely applicable to Los Angeles. So really thrilled to be with you. Our mission is to provide affordable housing for low-income families, seniors, and provide opportunities for those who are currently unhoused. So probably like many of you, we have an interest in serving a wide variety of folks in the SCAMP region. We're also growing, so the things that we're going to talk about today are things that we still apply to our principals when we're looking for new opportunities, and we have about 2,500 units in the pipeline where we're trying to develop in different communities across the state. So with that said, this is our quick agenda. We're going to talk just a little bit about where we find sites and how we start thinking about the analysis of those sites, a little bit into feasibility analysis and talking through zoning and entitlements, and then a couple of words about kind of, all right, what next after that, and a few words around working with our public agency partners and hopefully imparting a few of the best practices that we think about from the developer's standpoint. So let's jump into it. The next slide. So this is real, kind of high level stuff. These are the kinds of areas and places where we look for new opportunities to build affordable housing. And it's really a blend of looking for opportunities that come to us and our peers through requests for proposals from public agencies like a city or a county. Sometimes we see them from transportation agencies. We've worked on RFPs with local school districts, and also kind of a newer opportunity is when there are opportunities to develop on surplus land. So you'll see a Surplus Land Act notice come out either from one of the jurisdictions that we might have mentioned here or from the state. Those are kind of those formal competitive opportunities to look for opportunities. And then, of course, there's the ever-present opportunity to work with a real estate broker or an agent, and look at what's in the market, either listed or unlisted, depending on how closely you work with your real estate agents. Typically, we work with a handful of folks who know what we're looking for. And so they're always out and about talking to folks, either looking through what's publicly listed or what they call kind of a pocket listing or something off market. And that could be anything from vacant land to something that has an existing structure on it where we may need to demolish it and build new construction. We may be acquiring and rehabbing, or we're also looking at opportunities to take what's there and convert it to a different use, so adaptive reuse. That's something that we are all branching into a little bit more. Most of the session today, we're going to talk about new construction because that has a lot of the early analysis that's really useful here for us all to think about. And then, of course, there are other opportunities that you may find to work with other partners. So it could be a nonprofit organization or another church. Often there are market rate developers out there who recognize that they need to bring an affordable partner to provide an affordable housing component of their larger kind of mixed income master planned opportunities. So those are often interesting opportunities to find new places to develop. And then, of course, you can always look for other opportunities, just, kind of going through a jurisdiction's housing element or keeping an eye on any kind of new specific or community plan that that jurisdiction may be in the process of issuing, because they know that, or they're signaling in those plans what kind of new development they're looking for. So it always gives you some insight into where that jurisdiction is going. I should also say at the end of this presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. So hang on to your comments or put them in the chat. I'm just going to keep going and then we'll get to those questions at the end. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just kind of a rough cut. Let's say you found a site through one of the ways that we were just talking about. This is sort of some of the steps that we take to just initially get a handle on what we're looking at. So some obvious things, or maybe they're not obvious, things you need to know to start with. Obviously, you got to get a sense of how big that site is. Like, what kind of site area are we talking about? What kind of zoning is currently in place for it? And that information will help you just start to figure out how many units you can even place on that site. So if you are looking for a project that is going to, a site that would facilitate a large family project, you probably have a certain sense of how big your units need to be. And you'll have a calculator and maybe a little spreadsheet that helps you think about what's the average size of the units that you want to build. If you're doing a blend of, say, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom, you'll have an average across that unit spectrum. If you know you're just going to do a senior housing project, you probably have a really strong sense of, hey, they're all going to be maybe 1 bedroom units, for example, and you have a typical unit size for that. Having some basic criteria or understanding some basic criteria about what you plan to build is helpful in getting into the calculation of what you can fit on that site. Things you have to think about as you're doing that analysis, and we won't get into the nitty-gritty of that analysis here, but in general, kind of taking a look at, you've got a total site area, but then you need to start to shrink it a little bit once you understand, are there setback requirements? Is there something unusual on one corner or one part of the site that you won't be able to build on easily? Or is it a strange shape? Is it a triangle where you are going to have struggles to build, at the point of the triangles, because you're typically building a square rectangular building. So you start to carve out parts of the site that you probably can't use for dropping your building, and also thinking about the extra space you need to account for in a building beyond units. You have all this extra common space, corridors, those kinds of non-residential spaces. And we typically have a percentage of space that those uses take up. If you're working with an architect, they will have kind of a standard formula. So these are just things to help you kind of think through the baseline there. It's also really important to understand, is this site located in, what resource designation does this site have? If you're not familiar with that term, this is kind of um, a newer designation that has popped up in the last few years in working with the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, where there is a map. If you go to the TCAC website, if you just Google like TCAC opportunity map, you'll find it if you're not familiar with it. And this map will tell you what designation your site has. This designation, without getting into the really long explanation of it, it's intended to reflect a certain understanding around the kind of amenities and opportunities there are for a new development in that neighborhood. So you'll find a range of designations, and it's important to know this because it ultimately is tied to some of the funding you might apply for. So you'll see as we talk through this conversation that we kind of bounce back and forth between just kind of a quick look at a site analysis and feasibility, and then we jump to financing, and then we jump back. And so it's not necessarily like this linear process because we're pulling in information about different phases of the project that we need to think about up front. So understand what kind of designation your site has. Also, of course, understand what's currently there or was previously there. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of this site analysis in another slide or two. But it's really key to know, obviously, what's there right now, because if there's a big building, you can't necessarily just build on top of that building. You need to think about what are the other steps and costs that will be involved in order to transform that site into what you want to build. There's also environmental concerns, and we'll talk about that later too. The other one that's really big here is, are you looking at a site that has great proximity to neighborhood amenities that are really important for two reasons? One, they're important just to create opportunities for the households or families you're serving to easily get to all those key amenities that we all need in our lives and the places we live. But they're also really important for future scoring on your funding applications. So the general categories are many that you see here around good transit, access to public resources like schools and libraries, parks, grocery stores, medical resources. For those of you who don't spend time looking at, the tax credit funding application, I mention it here because these are key things that all projects really need to have in order to score the required points to compete for those important resources. So for those of you who work on the public agency side, as you're thinking about which sites should we identify in our housing element, think about this when you're thinking about designating sites for affordable housing development in your jurisdictional documents. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we've talked just a little bit about this, but this is kind of the really quick back of the envelope analysis. We need to understand what the current zoning is, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, can you build a multifamily project here based on the zoning? Or are you looking at something that is zoned for public parking or industrial use, not something that is necessarily conducive or allows for the kind of project you want to build? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't potentially take some steps to still build on that site, but you want to know right away sort of how challenging will it be to ultimately get to the point you want to get to in terms of what you're trying to build. Again, thinking about, well, how many units can I build here? That's important not only just for figuring out how big this project is, what fits, but also thinking about the financial feasibility of your project. And we won't spend this session talking a lot about financial feasibility because I know Ben did a session last week, but just kind of thinking about your project can't be too small or too large that it just won't work for the typical kinds of public funding sources you might be tracking down. So every developer out there has a little bit of a different kind of, I'll call it a minimum threshold, but when Abode Communities is looking for opportunities, we're typically looking for something that's large enough that we can at least get about 60, 70 units on. So we have kind of a reasonable operational and financial feasibility model, and the project is large enough to really make sense for us. How many units you have there will really depend on what you're building. If you're building a family project, you're going to need more space than if you are doing, say, 100% permit supportive housing or a senior project, which typically are going to have smaller unit sizes. So thinking through kind of the size and the scale of what you plan to build is really important. Really important to understand from the zoning and any other overlays from that city or that county. Is there anything else required there that you have to also plan to build? You may find some jurisdictions that certain zones may require like a mixed use project. So you need to think through, okay, well, if that's the site that I really want to spend time and energy on, what kind of commercial use would work here with what I'm trying to build? Or is there an opportunity to waive that requirement? Is there anything else that's necessary? Well, as you get into the analysis, and you may hear more about this in next week's session, thinking about all the nitty gritty of like open space and any other kind of things that the city or the county is looking for in addition to the units that you're building. So start to factor all that in as you work with your architect. Of course, everyone's favorite, how much parking is required? Now, this conversation around parking has changed a lot over the years, particularly with some of our new streamlining measures, which we'll talk about. But you may even have, from your own perspective, you might be looking at a site that technically doesn't require any parking, but you know that you want to provide a certain amount of parking based on the nature and the kind of the project that you're providing. So you have to factor in the space for that. And is it going to be surface? Is it going to be underground? Is it going to be at grade but under a podium? So thinking ahead about how many parking spaces and where those can fit is really important as well. We're going to talk a little bit about entitlements on the next couple of slides, but taking a look at that current zoning will tell you a little bit about what you can do and how the process will lay out for you. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but I just wanted to mention here that our initial, feasibility analysis always involves an understanding of whether or not that site is something we can build by right. We have to go through a ministerial process or a discretionary approval process, and we'll talk in a minute more about what that means. But in the meantime, back to what you're trying to visualize on the site. Height is important here, and again, this ties back into cost. So if you're thinking about doing a family project, can you fit that family project in 4 stories or less, or will it require going to 5 or more? That has an implication on some costs for your project, but also you need to think about height limits and whether or not what you are planning to build can fit there by right, or if you'll need to go through a process to get those extra height stories. And then, of course, I was mentioning at the very beginning, we kind of jump back and forth between initial analysis and financing. So folks that are really good at doing that early analysis and feasibility work also understand the range of what's out there, the world of affordable housing finance, and what permanent financing programs are available to support the kind of project that you're looking at. So there's an immediate connection around feasibility to, okay, I think we can fit it here. And I think that there are enough different kinds of public financing programs that will make this project feasible. Obviously, you get into a lot more time spent on that analysis and iterations of it, but it's really important right away to get a sense of, is this even financially feasible? Like, it sounds like a great project, but is there enough money out there from the different sources we typically work with to be able to put it together? Okay, now let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a few non-zoning things I want you to be sure that you're thinking about. We kind of put these under the category, we just call it due diligence, but these are other things that we're thinking about early on and then spending more time and money as we get further through what we'll call it the front end process. So you might secure a site and then spend more time on some of these because you have to commission reports and wait for that information to come in. But let's just touch on them briefly. I mentioned, that idea of having a triangular site. So it is important to take a look at the shape of that site that you're looking at initially, because odd shaped sites are harder to build on. You're automatically going to lose some site area typically in order to build a cost efficient building if you have a really odd lot shape. That doesn't mean you can't do something interesting with it. There's different kinds of outdoor amenities or other uses that you might consider for those, kind of corners or odd parts of the site where you're not necessarily going to be dropping a building footprint. But generally speaking, rectangular is always a little bit easier to work with. Same thing around kind of slope and soils. Does your site have a significant grade change that is going to be a little bit more challenging for your design team to work with? Or is it a little bit flatter? What kind of what kind of dirt does it have? Soils engineers are really important for this early analysis, or we call them the geotech sometimes. So understanding what's there and how easy it is to build on or build with. Um, Wires. I'm laughing because this is sometimes a challenge. It's really important to look right away to see what kind of constraints you might have on your site that have to do with existing um, overhead lines or other kinds of utilities information that you need to account for. So generally speaking, I would advise you to stay away from sites that have, power lines running straight across them. Things that are going to be challenging to adjust if you can't easily make those changes. So thinking about other agencies that have claims on that land are going to be tough to deal with. If you were talking to your architect, they would probably be right away thinking about when I drop this building footprint down onto this site, how challenging is it going to be to work with the fire department? Can we put together a building that has relatively easy access for the fire department based on the requirements of that fire department in that jurisdiction? There's a note here about avoiding really deep lots that make it hard for the fire department based on a certain department's rules, how to access the back of your building if it's tough to get there with a fire truck. Another thing, kind of like wires and utilities, is easements. Once you get a little deeper into the analysis of your site, pull the title report and make sure that, or commission a survey or both, and make sure that there's nothing else unusual recorded on title. There are often easements that the utility companies will have, but they may be at the very edge of your site and you can work around that. But you want to really look for things that are kind of stretching straight across your site. And again, existing uses, this could be any number of things on the site that you're looking at, but really important to think about and analyze right away. Is the building that's there have any kind of historic resource component, or could it be considered historic? That is generally a red flag because it is very expensive and intensive to figure out how to develop on a site that has a historic resource. It can be done, but always takes more energy, money, and time. And similarly, if you have an existing use where there's existing residential or commercial tenants that are living or operating at that site, you want to think about, okay, what is the process going to be to work with these tenants and move the development or the concept of my project forward? Do we need to relocate folks? If so, when does that need to happen? How much is that? Or you may decide, you know what, I'm not going to pursue this site because that amount of relocation is just too tricky or complicated, expensive, etc. A lot of the things that we're talking about here, you don't have to know all the answers yourself. You just need to have a great consultant who specializes in one of these topics. So I always think part of being a great developer is knowing who to call when you have questions that you don't know the answers to. And then finally, environmental conditions. That's really important. You may immediately have a concern based on something you see. It could be an existing use. They're like, hey, we need to take a closer look at whether or not there's any environmental concerns here. Either way, you're always going to get into what we call a phase 1 report to make sure that there aren't any conditions on the site that are going to create an environmental problem that you can't otherwise mitigate. Some sites will require a secondary analysis or a phase 2 analysis. You also will need to think about what's next to this site. Is there something next to the site or just down the road that might be potentially contributing an environmental hazard to the site or to the groundwater? So this is a handful of things that you always want to think about upfront. Some of these things take a little bit more time to explore, and usually you'll have that time depending on how you structure the front end of your transaction, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So let's go to the next slide. Oh, this is just a picture. So we're going to talk about zoning in a minute, but just for fun, I put the big picture zoning map of Los Angeles County. So it talks about all the different categories of use that you'll be needing to understand. Most of what we're going to talk about will cross around either commercial or residential. So let's go to the next slide. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with what zoning means, zoning is basically, it's found in a jurisdiction's municipal code. So zoning is not building code. These are two different things. So zoning really talks about kind of allowable uses in general for a site or a neighborhood or, a certain boundary. Every jurisdiction typically has maps and a legend, and it kind of explains this. And then the code will go into great detail around what each of those designations means. So you can look up what an R2 zone means, like a residential -2 zone, or a commercial 1, depending on how complicated the jurisdiction zoning code is. There's a legend basically to understand it. And this tells you generally what is expected for development in that neighborhood on that typical property with that kind of zoning. Many jurisdictions now have zoning that accommodates multifamily, or they'll have even a commercial zone that allows for multifamily. So you just have to spend a little bit of time getting to know how your particular jurisdiction sets up its kind of land use governance. We talked earlier about some of the early things you need to think about, but many of the typical issues that you and your design team will need to look at are beyond use, which we've just talked about, which is how many units in general are allowed there in terms of density. What are the height limits? Are there setback requirements? What is the story around parking, lot size, open space, and floor area ratio? If these are new terms for you, spend some time just Googling them, talking with your architect, just getting more familiar with them. If this is new for you, it will become kind of, you'll have it all memorized really soon. Now, having said all of that, we are definitely in an era where over the last few years, there have been a lot of new tools created in order to help create affordable housing in or on sites or in neighborhoods that maybe weren't necessarily envisioned as multifamily or a certain size. So things like the state density bonus can help you navigate where you need some flexibility on some of these issues that we just talked about that are covered by the zoning code. So things around open space or parking or a height. Tools like the state density bonus can help you get some adjustments there in exchange for providing affordable housing to that jurisdiction. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so just a quick kind of 101 on entitlements if you're not familiar with it. Entitlements is just a term we use for the land use approval process that you need to go through when you're working on a particular site. When you go through this process, there will be an outcome, typically what we call a determination letter. We use this term by right for projects that typically really don't need to go through a lengthy process. We start to blend a little bit these days the idea of a by right project and a project that uses a streamlined, what we call a streamlined ministerial project. But for those of us who have been doing this for a while, we used to joke that it was really hard to find a by right project because there was always something that needed an adjustment in a given site's set of requirements or a plan for development. These days, most of the affordable housing projects that many of us work on are typically utilizing one of these new streamlined tools where we don't have to go through the more lengthy process to go through, say, like a planning commission process, and that's considered discretionary. But we can use one of these tools like the state density bonus and have the projects approved at the staff level of a city or a county, whoever's jurisdiction it is. And that makes for a much more kind of straightforward process and also a little bit more clarity around what is expected. So we know that if we provide X, Y, Z, we will get our approval letter and be able to move forward towards the rest of the steps in the process. So if we go to the next slide, we could talk a little bit more about that. So these three categories of, entitlements or land use process are discretionary, ministerial, and by right. And as I was saying, ministerial and by right are starting to get blended a little bit, but I've separated them here just for a little bit of an ease of use. So discretionary approval processes are the ones that take the longest, are most risky because there is no kind of certainty that the end of the process will result in exactly what you are expecting, because there is discretion there. So there may be requests made by community members or folks on the planning commission or city council, depending upon how this process works, that require you to make further changes to your initially conceptualized project. These kind of processes can take quite some time, 12 months or more. I call them least desirable because of that the risk and the time, as well as the expense. They usually require the most amount of reports and kind of design and engineering. There's back and forth. Ministerial is where we spend a lot of our time. So these are projects that would use a number of the new tools like a density bonus. And this is a little bit more straightforward. There's kind of a menu of options. You kind of know ahead of the time, okay, these are the expectations of my project. And if I kind of check the box, so to speak, if I make sure that I've included all of the things that are required under this ministerial process, then I will come out with a letter of determination that clearly says I have the approval to build that project. And it's effectively what I started with. And then, of course, buy right is, as we joke, much harder to find. Of course, they're the most cost efficient and they're the fastest because they don't typically require much of a process. We spend most of our time in that ministerial part of the world. Again, really important to remember that the process that you go through will have a letter, and you've got to follow the terms of that letter, which includes conditions. So depending on how detailed that process is, if you're discretionary, it's probably longer than if you go through the ministerial process. But just really key to remember that you do need to follow what is required in that determination letter as you're making your way towards plan check and ultimately pulling a building permit for your project. And then, of course, it's probably worth mentioning here that land use processes typically come with some sort of CEQA clearance requirement. So when we say CEQA, it's just the California Environmental Quality Act. So you need an environmental clearance typically to get your project approved. Now, these days, there are many tools that will allow an affordable housing project to obtain an exemption. So you don't have to go through a more detailed environmental approval process. But before many of these exemptions were available, we would spend time commissioning certain reports, and you would look for an environmental clearance, often in the form of what we call a mitigated negative declaration, which essentially means there were no environmental impacts found by this project as proposed that can't be mitigated. Basically says you're in good shape. The most intense form of an environmental clearance process is to go through an environmental impact report process, or what we call an EIR. Those can be very expensive, very time intensive, and a lengthy process. So most of us don't focus on sites that require that kind of a discretionary and an EIR process. So most of the time now, we're doing a ministerial project that typically would have an exemption built in, occasionally doing the MND, or the mitigated negative declaration process. If you have questions, it's really important to bring on your land use consultant or your land use attorney to help you understand and think through what's applicable based on the tools and the project and the site that you have, and what are your options for the most expedited path. And then, of course, really important to remember, I think many people know this, but not everybody, most of the funding sources that we all need to secure to build our affordable housing projects require entitlements. So when you're thinking about your overall development timeline, make sure that you have put together a timeline or a sequence that accounts for when those entitlements will be in place, and make sure that they line up with your applications for funding so you don't have a mismatch. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Just a word on kind of community support. So Abode Communities and many of our peers, we believe in the importance of community engagement, and that looks different on every project in every jurisdiction. But those of you who do this work a little bit more regularly will often think about, okay, I've done the kind of technical analysis of the site, but what do I need to know about the environment, the neighborhood, the jurisdiction in general that I'm thinking about working in? Is this a pro-housing city? Is this a neighborhood that has seen affordable housing before? Or, kind of getting a sense of what the environment is like. And then we spend some time connecting with people, right? We want to connect with the local electeds. We want to connect with community organizations in the neighborhood. Could be any number of groups or people, businesses, etc. Trying to make sure that we understand and, what's happening in that community, what their needs are, what their concerns are, what affordable housing means to them, and making sure we're having some of those meaningful conversations. We spent time earlier talking about kind of these streamlined approval processes for land use that don't necessarily have the same level of I'll call it required community engagement that you would otherwise need to go through if you're going through a discretionary process with an EIR. Many of us, though, believe that regardless of that, we value this community engagement conversation and process, and we're gonna do that anyway, because we're going to be in the neighborhood long term. We want to be good neighbors and ultimately foster kind of a neighborhood conversation. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you spent time doing the analysis on your site, and now you want to move forward with it. Depending on what sort of opportunity you're looking at, you have a couple of options on the private market side. So, and of course, like many things, this ebbs and flows with the business and the real estate cycle. So often we like to, if we're going to purchase a property, we're looking for a seller that's patient, that is willing to work with us and go into a long escrow so that we don't automatically have to purchase that property and start spending money on, acquisition interest that goes with an acquisition loan. So kind of minimizing expense, making some, deposits or otherwise, putting good deposit up to hold on to that site, but it gives you the time to work out some of the details, work through all the things that we just talked about, as well as maybe even add a financing contingency to your process. Others, depending on the market and who that seller is, they might just not be interested in it. And so sometimes you can get maybe a little bit of a better price in exchange for acquiring that property right away. And then of course, you're bearing more of the risks as the owner developer, but you've got a benefit maybe of a better price. It really just depends on what business cycle we're in and kind of how desperate folks are to sell or hold for a while you're working through your development timeline process. Ideally, our favorite ones are, you're in escrow the whole time. You don't actually have to close until right before you're starting construction. Typically, we find something in the middle where we'll get some amount of time to work through maybe entitlements, but then we've got to purchase the property right after that. And then on the flip side, if you're looking at an opportunity like the RFPs that we talked about, you're probably working with a public agency who is going to hold on to that land until you start construction. Either they will donate it or sell it to you, or you'll enter into a long-term ground lease with that agency. So those kinds of opportunities are a little bit more financially feasible on the front end. You're still spending money on your design team, your land use team, all the other folks that you're working with to move the project through the pre-construction process, but you're not having to spend money and take on risk around owning that land. So pros and cons to each method. It just really depends on the opportunity. But these are the two typical types of transactions that we see. Again, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the opportunity to partner with someone. You might end up partnering with someone that already owns the property, like a market rate developer or a church, and then you can have a different kind of quasi transactional structure. Let's go to the next slide. This is just sort of a reminder, kind of regardless of what your transactional structure is and what your entitlements process may or may not be, you just need to have a really good sense of how do you get from start to finish. So how long will it take you to generally work through that front end analysis, all that due diligence, then getting your architecture and engineering team off the ground, getting your concept design ready so that you can submit it to the city or the county for your land use approval process. Then transition to the time it takes to secure your financing, which varies a little bit, but on average, we can say it takes a couple of years here. And then once you have most of your financing, if not all of it secured, then the time you need to finish with your design phases and ultimately get your project permitted. And then, of course, you've got construction, which also varies widely, but a lot of the projects we work on are somewhere between like 15 and 20 months of construction. And then you've got that extra 6 to 9 months, depending on the kind of project you have. It will take you to lease up and stabilize and convert to your permanent financing. So I know we said we weren't going to talk about financing, but I think just understanding the entire cycle of that pre-construction process is important when you're doing that front-end analysis and budgeting for what it's going to cost and how long it will take you to get to the very end of the project. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, we're almost there. Just a couple more slides, friends. This is probably a no-brainer, but just a reminder that the decisions that you make early on will have a major impact and determine really how your project is going to end up. As I mentioned, if you're going through that discretionary approval process, a lot more risk that you may have to add or change things that you hadn't planned on doing versus the more streamlined approach. Everybody wants to avoid a very, very expensive project. So a lot of the time that we spend, and many of you spend, thinking about how you work with the community, with your public agency partners, is navigating, we all want the most beautiful building possible. We want it to be cost efficient and durable and sustainable. And so you're having to make a lot of choices along the way and trying to figure out where is that happy medium, or how do you thread the needle around the aesthetics versus durability, high quality sustainability. It's really important to try to avoid putting really anything quote unquote extra into your project that's really not essential and going to be useful and meaningful to the folks that live in the building or to the surrounding neighborhood. And then of course everybody knows late stage changes in your design always cost more at the back end than they do in the very early stages. So those of you who do this a lot or hope to do this a lot as you're embarking on your development career, just really, really key reminders here to try and figure it out early with your team. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we've just got a couple slides about best practices. So, realistic housing elements are really important. And these are some of these concepts, talking about housing elements 5 years ago was a little bit different than talking about housing elements now, because we know that our friends at public agencies are having to spend more energy and time really getting those housing elements lined up so that the HCD approves them and they're considered realistic and that we can actually utilize those sites. So we really want to work with you. We want to find great sites for affordable housing development, and they've got to be of reasonable size, shape, et cetera, kind of all the things that we talked about earlier. It really helps us if the zoning in place already accommodates the kind of project we want to build generally and doesn't come with extras like requiring retail on the ground floor. Just for those of you who aren't developers and you work in the public agency side, that just complicates the cost of the project, the risk around how to lease up that space. Anything that's sort of extra but doesn't necessarily contribute to furthering affordable housing itself is great to sort of streamline and try to eliminate from the goals of affordable housing. That doesn't mean we're not building wonderful projects with great on-site amenities, but those extras can be really expensive or unnecessary. So ultimately, we hope that we would land somewhere with a site that has either everything is so well in place that it's effectively a buy right opportunity, or in a kind of quote unquote worst case, we can use one of our streamlining tools and get through the process pretty quickly. So, if we can get a project entitled in 6-7 months, that's fantastic. Faster is even better through that buy right process. And let's go, I think, to our last slide now. A couple other just things to mention. Again, utilities, the electrical grid, water, gas, all those things. We want to be building, we're typically building in infill areas anyway, but we really want to be working on sites where we know the infrastructure is already there, that it is not going to cost, say, $1 million to upgrade the utility infrastructure in the neighborhood just to facilitate building more affordable housing. So that's a really big deal. And we hope that we can find public partners who think about these things ahead of time and are looking and designating sites that have that kind of infrastructure. Of course, the best projects are in those jurisdictions where housing, planning, council staff, everybody is really working in partnership towards the goal of building this desperately needed affordable housing. So really collaborative teams and processes are always just a joy to work with, and just help make the project move faster and turns out with a great result. And of course, I would not be an affordable housing developer if I didn't leave you with this final comment. On the public agency side, we really need funding commitments as early as possible. Most affordable housing projects have to have local commitments for funding in order for us to move forward and leverage funds at the state level or the county level, depending on, kind of the layers of funding that you're looking for. But those local dollars committed to the project early on are absolutely essential and really meaningful. And we hope that those of you who are on the public agency side and thinking about how you're going to get more affordable housing moving forward in your city are also thinking about how do we bring some resources to developers as well as land to help move those projects forward and provide more housing to help meet our housing crisis. So I'm going to stop there. I know I talked a lot and talked really fast, and see if we can maybe grab a few questions, and I'm going to get some help here from my partners at SCAMF.
Hi, thanks, Laura. That was fantastic. And thanks everyone for all their great questions. So reviewing over the Q&A box, there's a chunk of them about the community engagement portion. So I have rounded up some of those questions. So quick one, if it's by right, does that mean it needs no community engagement? Do you know? And then I have a few other ones. That's
when we think about by right sites, we think about basically like you could walk up to the building and safety department and drop plans on the counter and say, I'm here to plan check this. And there would be kind of no interim, planning and land use approval process, because that site is basically all the rules that apply to that site. You're already in line with them. It doesn't happen all the time, but that's what we mean by right. Where we really spend most of our time is in that, like, we don't need to go through that more complicated discretionary process, but we do need to go through some sort of process with staff in the planning department to confirm that what we're proposing meets the zoning or the opportunities we have to get some waivers from some of the items in the zoning code.
So, okay, that makes sense. And then, are there any funding streams that require you to get community engagement? That's the first one. And then the second one is, why is it useful and why could it be not useful? I don't know. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I was just adjusting my giant Airline Pilot headphones here. Let's see. There are some funding sources that require community engagement. The one that comes to the top of mind is the ASIC program, or the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. I believe that one definitely calls for demonstrated community engagement plan. I'm sure there are others, but that's the one that pops into my mind. Many of the local programs don't necessarily require it, but you may be working with partners at, the planning department or your elected official that want to see you go through that process anyway, but it's not maybe technically required by some of the funding. Oh, and then the second question was, how can it be or not be beneficial?
Or, someone mentioned NIMBY roadblocks. So that was a more diplomatic way of saying to talk about that.
Oh, yes, that's right. Maybe I didn't touch enough on that slide. Yeah, I think it's a challenge, right? So ideally, we're engaging in a community outreach process where we're finding supporters. for the affordable housing, right? Like we always want to find supporters first, so that feels like, yeah, there's a lot of people with us that want this affordable housing in this particular neighborhood or location. So that's kind of where it can be positive, right? And you're going to get great feedback about, hey, I want to tell you about something that's been happening down the block. And, because of the site that you're looking to build, like, let's just say this site has really been a nuisance because people have been really, dumping on it, or like something negative is happening in the community. And they're glad that you're coming in to work with them to, revitalize that site. But there are things that you need to understand, or there are certain wishes that the community might have. I think be kind of beyond the housing, you might get requests for, it could be anything, but let's just say open space, extra open space that's available to the public. These conversations are really important, but they can also be challenging because there may be things that the community is looking for that you may not be able to facilitate on the site that you are developing, but you recognize the importance of them. And so we try to do what we can, where and when we can, that's within budget, to kind of address a number of those needs. The downside, I guess, of the community engagement, maybe where that question is coming from, is you might run into a bunch of NIMBYs who, really, they'll disguise it as something else, but they really they just don't want affordable housing in that neighborhood. And it may come in the form of saying you don't have enough parking, or any number of excuses. Parking is a good one that people like to use, or attack your environmental clearance, or the idea that you could get an exemption. So community engagement is, I think, it's important, challenging, sometimes hard, sometimes great work. So it really varies, and it's always an area for many of us to grow in. The other thing about community engagement is probably worth mentioning here is we love working with jurisdictions that are, they have spent some of their own time thinking about affordable housing for a given, maybe a site that they're putting out for RFP process. And they've spent time in the community before they ever reached out to developers, talking about, hey, we own this site, and we want to see it developed as affordable housing, and getting the pulse of the neighborhood and understanding kind of some of the concerns before the developers even kind of enter the conversation with the owner of that property.
Great. I have a question for you. So what are the zoning design requirements that cause the most significant barriers for a development? Besides parking, what would you most like relief from?
Well, I think I mentioned this. I would really like to get away from any zoning requirements that look for a mixed use. So having to put in some sort of commercial use in addition to the resident, like commercial at the ground floor. Those are always tricky. And they're challenging, not only because the affordable housing financing program, so to speak, that we all work with, there really aren't dollars designated, generally speaking, to also build commercial, right? So they're always eating into, or eroding, so to speak, the amount of funding that you might have attached to your project, that you're trying to figure out, how in the world am I going to also pay for the construction of the commercial space, when most of the dollars are really just focused on construction of affordable. So it's just a financial strain on the project. That's one of the ones I really like to avoid. Occasionally you'll see, I'm trying to think of a few odd ones that we've come across. We've come across some odd ones where, like, there are really specific design requirements. I think we had a site, I will not name the neighborhood, where the community plan, it was an old community plan, and it required that the roofs all had to be pitched. Like, it's very, very specific. Pitched roofs are not something that you typically see on a lot of multifamily affordable housing projects. So maybe that's a specific answer to a more general concept, which is overly prescriptive design requirements can be challenging.
So going back to streamlining, or switching gears to streamlining, which is a part of this regulations aspect, 2 questions. How often do you feel like SB 35 is utilized to help push forward affordable housing development? And what effect will Mayor Bass's recent streamlining efforts have on all of this, if you have any input on that?
Yeah, those are great questions. Well, I can say I can't speak for the state or the industry as a whole, but I can tell you that we are using SB 35 a lot in conjunction with like a density bonus application because of the timing requirements or the limitations on how long it can or should take a jurisdiction to process our land use approval process. So we have found SB 35 to be pretty helpful and helping move the process along. So streamlining tools like that, I think, will continue to be useful. And there are others out there. It's not just that one, but I think that was one you mentioned in particular. And then in the city of LA, we were just talking about this earlier today here in the office. We're really excited about Executive Directive 1. We're kind of testing it out right now, either around, mostly around plan check, but really hopeful that we can see real results from that directive. Like the idea that you could be permitted much faster than normal, or that your land use approval process could go much faster than normal, I think is really exciting. And in a place like the city of LA, Executive Directive 1 should be even more valuable than, say, SB 35, because the time period is even shorter to get your project approved.
And then, Laura, you just said plan check, and just want to make sure for folks who may not know what that means per se, you just want to give us
Oh yeah, sorry, everybody. So plan check is just the general term for the phase of work we go through. So you've already got your land use approval process. So all the things we talked about earlier, you've got your entitlements in place. Now you need to turn and focus on detailing out your drawings for the construction phase of the project. So your architect will spend time making the conceptual drawings very detailed. You know, the set is like this thick. That's what you submit to the city ultimately, so you can get your building permit. So your plan check process to ultimately get to a building permit, which can take a very long time, should be expedited now, at least in the city of Los Angeles. And we hope to see similar things in other jurisdictions that are really committed to expediting affordable housing development.
There's a couple questions about conversion of commercial real estate or adaptive reuse projects to affordable housing. And so in your view, sort of how feasible is it to kind of convert those buildings, or as a developer, how do you assess the difference between doing conversions just versus new construction?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And for those of you who are on today and are going to be on next week's call, which I think it's John Arnold next week, make sure you ask him that question, because his firm has actually spent a lot of time working on adaptive reuse projects in the city of Los Angeles, not necessarily affordable conversions, although some. So we've done a couple of them. And I'm thinking about both home key projects where we're taking, you know, a motel and converting it to affordable use. We've also done a project in a different jurisdiction in LA County, where we're taking a project that used to be like a laboratory and then a school, and then we're converting it to affordable senior housing. What I would not consider us experts yet. We're really trying to learn a lot about how to broaden the range of adaptive reuse opportunities. I think that the cost and the ease really depend on what that initial use is. So I have heard, and this is a good question for John next week, that like old hospitals or, you know, clinical buildings may be a little bit easier to convert than, say, an office building, because of the way that the plumbing and the floor plans or the floor plates are laid out. So those things that are really essential that you're going to need in the new project that can be very expensive to relocate, to rerun. Those are things that you definitely want to pay attention to. And I'm super excited. I hope maybe next year, or 2 years from now, SCAMP will have a whole bunch of projects in our member portfolio to talk about how adaptive reuse was successfully utilized. But I think it's a really exciting and promising part of the field, but I would say maybe not common yet, but I think that there is some potential, and it takes finding the right design and engineering team too.
There's so many fantastic questions left in the chat, and we are right at 2 o'clock. So thank you again, Laura. I feel like we could have this discussion for another hour and a half. For those of you who wrote in the chat box or in the Q&A box and really are dying to get those answers to those questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You'll get an email from me following this presentation with the slide deck from today, the recording from this presentation, as well as a survey, as we usually do, to learn from you if this is helpful or not. So thanks again, Laura. We really appreciate your time and fantastic job as always.
Thanks, my pleasure. And thank you everyone for attending. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but maybe Ariana and I can find a way to get you some answers after the presentation. Thanks all.
Thanks everyone. Take care.